Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Roy DeRocha. I am presenting the consumer insights portion of this project, a sensory-directed approach to understanding artisan cheese. A little bit about myself as we begin the webinar. I am the sensory practice leader at UVM Extension's Northwest Crops and Soils program. I work for Dr. Heather Darby. I am a sensory and consumer insights expert with over 40 years of global experience. My formal education is in chemistry from Tufts University, but my real education has come from working with companies around the globe on descriptive sensory and consumer insight issues. This project has many components to it. These photographs show you some of them. On the bottom left, you see some of the knowledge transfer, where we're training some of the folks at the cheese companies. In that case, it's Jasper Hill. In the middle, it's Springbrook Farm. We're also doing some very innovative sensory-directed chemical analysis, which will all be discussed in separate webinars. Now, this project, a sensory-directed approach to understanding artisan cheese, is really about linking information and linking critical information to really understand what drives success. And by that, I mean, what drives what people want to eat and want to eat often. And so we need to collect data. And we collected data on the cheese making process. And that was done in collaboration with two cheesemakers, Jasper Hill Farm and Springbrook Farm. We then used our descriptive sensory analysis panel at the University of Vermont Extension. This is what we refer to as our trained panel, to generate objective data on cheese samples. And I'll share some of that with you even in this consumer testing webinar. We had microbiology analysis done by Dr. Ben Wolf down at Tufts University, and we will be linking in that data later. We had chemical analysis done also at Tufts University, and I showed you the picture earlier of myself sitting at the instrument that's located at Tufts to try to do what's called sensory-directed chemical analysis. We did at University of Vermont fatty acid analysis, looking at healthy fatty acids, and we'll be linking that in. And then, of course, we collected some consumer information to answer the question, so what? What is important, what's not, based on what consumers like and what consumers don't like. Now, a couple of cautions as I begin this webinar, because even though this webinar is the consumer research portion of the bigger project, it's not a traditional consumer research project in that it's not a standalone project. Our objective of this work was to explore specifically what sensory characteristics were driving consumer liking up or down when it comes to people that eat artisan cheese. We also wanted to generate information at the attribute level from the consumers that we can link to all that other objective data. So rather than focusing on the brands and saying, okay, we're testing this brand and what do they think about this brand? What I'd like you to think about as I go through this webinar is it's not the brands we're testing. It's the sensory properties that the brands represent. So it's the intensity of flavor, it's the level of mouthfeel, it's the cheese intensity, it's those individual sensory attributes that we're trying to measure as we walk through this process, because we want to link those things to the chemistry, the microbiology, the healthy fats. Be giving you some information on the brands we used and how people liked or didn't like those brands. And I will qualify that to some degree, because this was also not to focus on consumer segmentation. We would be running a different study with different samples and different designs if we really were trying to understand the nature and the size of different segments within the artisan cheese world. We're not doing that type of segmentation here. What we're trying to do is in a macro level, in a big level, look at the bigger segment, which is a cross section of cheese users who eat all kinds of cheese, and find out what drives what they like and don't like. And then get some hints about some of those other segments so that we can do follow-on work with our cheese collaborators and answer more in-depth questions. But at this stage of the game, we're trying to link microbiology and chemistry to flavor and then begin to answer the so what question. And so that's why we decided to do the type of consumer testing that I'm about to share with you. And I will qualify that even further as we go through this webinar. Now, we conducted multiple tests over the 3 years of this program. The first of which was back in October of 2021, what we call our University of Vermont Extension Field Day, which is typically held up at our farm up in Borderview. And we have a big cross-section of people come in. We have farmers come in, families of farmers, other interested people. So it represents a pretty nice cross-section of the population. Now, we also did an innovative test, and this is the most exciting thing I'd like to talk about in this webinar, and we call that PEM. That was using people from Alberg, which is up near the farm, but also in Rutland, which is more central to Vermont. And then we repeated the hedonic test by going to some cheese shops and interacting with other people across the city of Burlington, Vermont, to collect some additional overall liking data on some additional samples that represented perhaps a bigger range in flavor that we were interested in testing. And so I'd like to begin with the field day, which was back in 2021. It was a hedonic test, very simple. We had 55 people that wanted to participate in the cheese tasting while they were at the farm. They represented a wide range of age. And when we talked to them verbally, you know, they told us what kind of cheese they liked. They all said they ate artisan cheese, but there was a range. And, you know, did they eat regular Vermont cheddar? Did they only eat artisan? And we thought we got a pretty good range of age and sex and types of cheese that they commonly purchased and consumed. Now, in the test that we were giving them, there were 6 artisan cheese samples. So from Jasper Hill, we had their mature cheese, which is the Alfred Toman. We also had Whitney and a very unique cheese, which is Harbison. It's a bloomy rind cheese that it's got a little band of spruce around it. Those of you out there who know it know that it's somewhat unique in the artisan cheese world. And then we had 3 samples from Springbrook Farm. One was Tarentaise, which is their mature cheese, and Ashbrook and Reading, the 2 of their other big sellers. All of the samples, of course, were coded and assessed blind. Nobody knew what they were testing. And we chose these cheeses because we had pre-screened with our collaborators their cheeses and decided that these gave us a nice range in sensory attributes that we thought going into this might be important to end users. And so again, we chose the cheeses not because we wanted to test these particular brands for the brand's sake, but because of the flavor that they represented. We used a standard 9-point degrees of liking scale. This is very common in doing hedonic testing for all of you consumer researchers out there. We love to use this scale. The middle point is neutral, neither liked or disliked. As you go to the right of neutral, you get degrees of liking. So a 6 would be slightly liked, a 7 a little bit more, an 8 very liked, and a 9 would be the best sample that I ever had. And if you go to the left of center, we have degrees of not liking or dislike. And again, if you go to a 4, well, you don't like it a little bit. If you go to a 3, you really don't like it. A 2, boy, you're beginning to hate that. And a 1 would be the worst sample you ever had. Now, you notice on this slide that we're using happy face scales. And the reason we do that is that one of the things that we've learned over time, and many of you have as well, is that there can be confusion around this degrees of liking scale. Numbers, even if you put labels on them and tell them the middle, the 5 is a neutral, to the right of it is how much you like it, the higher number, the more you like it, to the left of it, the lower the number, the more you don't like it. What consumers will do, about 30%, is as they start to taste the samples, in this case cheese, if they taste a sample and they say, oh, I like this a little bit, they'll give it a 2 because they're not looking at the labels, they're getting confused, and a 2 seems like, okay, that's a little bit like, and a 3 would be more, when in fact this scale is not that at all. A 2 would be one of the most disliked samples. So we got in the habit of using these happy face scales because there is no confusion when you ask them, just click off a face on how you feel. And if they really hate it, well, they're going to pick off one of those ones with a big frown. And if they like it a little bit, well, they're going to go to that circle above number 6 and say, well, that's a little bit of a smile or a bigger smile. And it really helps us to avoid all of the confusion with the scales and gives us more confidence in the numbers that they are providing to us. And so we use this score sheet throughout the testing, throughout all of our tests, and use this standard 9-point degrees of liking scale. Now, at our field day, if we just quickly and simply take average scores, you can imagine we're going into the data deeper than this, but this is the macro level that we need for the rest of the project. We can, even at this point, notice a few things about the consumers because we know a little bit about the cheese and the flavor of the cheese that we're testing. The Alfred-Toman and the Tarentaise scored 2 of the highest cheeses on average overall liking. These are the more mature cheeses. These are 10 months in the cave versus 2 or 3 months in the cave. And it appears that as a group, people like the flavor of mature cheese better than young cheese. You notice in the middle of the pack from Springbrook Farm, we've got Ashbrook and Reading, and they score kind of similar. And then you notice the Whitney and the Harbison, which score down just above neutral. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later because one of the things that we do see is that there is flavor segmentation, even though we're not researching it in this project, and that some of these cheeses are very polarizing, meaning there are segments that like the flavor of these cheeses, and there are segments that don't like these. And one way we can illustrate that is by simply putting out some distributions of how people scored the cheeses. So these graphs are simply how many people gave it a 1 or 2, 3, 4 on that degrees of liking scale. And you can notice for the mature cheeses over here on the left, the Alfred-Toman and the Tarentaise heavily weighted to the right-hand side of the scale, meaning most of the people scored at 7, 8s, and 9s or 6s, 7s, and 8s. Meaning that most of the people really like those cheeses. And when you look at the Whitney and the Harbison, you see a more even distribution, especially with the Harbison here. If we look across here, meaning that it was very polarizing. We had some people that tested it that scored very high numbers, and some people that tested it that were down at the I don't like it, even to the I really don't like it, I hate it stage. When we see an even distribution like this in this kind of a graphic, it really compels us to then go and ask more questions, do a much more detailed screener, and separate the data out, test with more people, and separate the people out so that we can define, well, okay, what percentage of people really fell in that segment? How big is that segment? How big is that opportunity? But again, that's a different study. For this work at the moment, we're simply noting this information so that we can do further work down the line, but we're going to use simple averages to help us link to some of the other data in the study. Now, we then, I'm going to skip to 2023 and save the PEM testing, which happened in between, for a little bit later in this webinar, because that's very unique. This testing in Burlington was very similar to what we did at Field Day. In this case, we went up to cheese shops and interacted with people at the university. We had about 55 people. Again, this was a random mix of age and usage, although everyone indicated that they did purchase and consume artisan cheese. Requirement for this study. We changed up the sample set a little bit. We decided to add in some blue cheese. We still had in the 2 aged cheeses and the Harbison. The Ashbrook and the Reading were so close, we took the Reading out and just left in the Ashbrook. Again, what we're trying to do is represent ranges in sensory properties, not necessarily testing particular brands. And we use the same degrees of overall liking scale as we did at Field Day. And here are some of the average results from that test. Now, several things that are really nice to see here. First of all, that the aged cheeses, again, not only score higher on overall liking on average, but they're scoring up around a 7, between a 7 and an 8, which is consistent with the data we saw previously that we got at Field Day. We noticed that the Ashbrook falls down into the 6s. And remember, the Ashbrook and the Reading were mid to low 6s in the Field Day test. We noticed the Harbison, again, was somewhat polarizing. and scored on average closer to neutral. All of this is very consistent with field day, gives us a little bit more confidence in the mixture of people we're using and the consistency of the results. When we look at the Bailey Hazen Blue, we find, well, that's very interesting. That kind of falls in between the mature cheese and some of those other cheeses. And, you know, blue cheese is on the mature cheese side and a more complex type of cheese anyways. Again, we can look at distribution to understand if we have segmentation possibly going on. Very consistent with the field day results. You can look at the two mature cheeses on the left. That would be Alfred Toman and Tarentaise. And in this test, even more so than field day, look at the percentage of people, how high those bars go up, indicating numbers of people that scored at 7, 8s, and 9s for both of those cheeses. You notice for the Ashbrook that, you know, again, we've got kind of a bell-shaped curve. We've got a lot of people around that 5, 6, 7. Doesn't really appear there's a whole lot of segmentation going on there. But when we look at the Harbison and the Bailey Hazen Blue, very similar distribution to what we saw with field day, where, you know, we've got people on both sides of that degrees of liking, giving us polarized response. Some people liked it, some people didn't like it. And again, what that tells us is that more likely than not, there are some very unique flavor segments for some of these products. We know that all of these cheeses that Jasper Hill and Springbrook make sell very well, so there are markets for them. But for the purpose of our study, we're looking at the biggest segment and trying to use that segment and responses from that segment to link to all of the other data that we're generating in the study. But this is really interesting for the cheesemakers to see these kinds of distributions and to understand these issues. Now, when it comes to diving deeper into the consumers themselves, into the cheese users, it's not an easy thing to do. And anyone out there that has done consumer research knows how not only complex and difficult it can be, but how misleading it can be. Because consumers have a very good ability of telling us what they like and don't like, but they really have a difficult time telling us why, expressing themselves. What was it they liked? What was it they didn't like? In fact, what makes it even more complex for those of us doing consumer insight work is that very often consumers will use terms that we think we know what they mean, but they actually mean something different. And so it becomes very, very misleading. Well, back many years ago at a company called Arthur D. Little, it's a company that I worked with for the first 20 years of my career, we began to see that focus groups, anytime we had a group of people together and try to ask them questions about products, were one of the reasons that products were failing in the market. You may hear the term very often that 9 out of 10 new products fail. Well, one of the leaders of failure are what we call filters. And here's what I mean by filters. When you do a traditional focus group, there are multiple places where you can filter and misinterpret information. The first one is the person sitting at the table who is the facilitator. Facilitators ask questions, and in focus groups, facilitators are trained to ask leading questions. How much did you like the salt? How much did you like the cheese flavor? Did you like that footy taste? These are very leading questions, and consumers will answer those questions. The problem is, it doesn't mean that that thing is important to them. If you say, what do you think about cheese flavor? Oh, well, I love cheese flavor. Someone might make the mistake and say, well, that's an important thing. We need to focus on the cheese flavor, or we need to focus on the cheese intensity, when in fact, it's not important to them. They're just answering the question you asked them. So you ask very leading questions. The second filter, and this one actually is even more responsive, are people that are watching and monitoring from behind the glass window, the two-way window, because they have selective hearing. And as people start to discuss things in the room, might hear, ooh, I love the way that musty flavor develops. And the cheesemaker might say, you see, we have to go to the caves and we have to figure out, how to get that mustiness. And someone else in the room might say, but I really like the package this is in. Look how nice this looks. And a packaging person behind the window might say, no, we need to focus on packaging because that's most important to them. And depending on the selective hearing of people either looking from behind the window or reviewing data after it's generated, they're filtering it through their perspective, and they're not really listening to what the user is saying, what the cheese user is saying. And so Arthur D. Little developed a method called the Product Attribute Elicitation Method. We refer to it as PEM, P-E-M, to remove all of those filters, to basically walk people through a process where they smell and taste samples. They create all the information on their own without any leading questions from us. They then take that information and score things objectively. And then we take that database and correlate it against objective measures to interpret what they mean and what they said. And so let me show you what we did in this case. So we did this using two groups of cheese consumers. One group was up in Alberg, and one group was down in Rutland. We did actually do a little bit more screening to try to just dive a little deeper into possible segmentation and what might be going on. So the group that was up in Alberg were people who said they sometimes ate artisan cheese, versus the ones in Rutland where we focused on a small group of people that said they mostly eat artisan cheese, just to see what kind of differences we might begin to see. Again, it wasn't a focus of this bigger study, but we want to have these insights as we start to do the linkage and as we share this information back to the cheesemakers to give them more directional information. We use 6 samples in the PEM testing. We had 4 samples that we had tested and actually collected other data on in March of 2022. That was Redding and Ashbrook from Springbrook Farms and Whitney and Harbison from Jasper Hill. We put in 2 additional cheeses, both of them representing kind of different maturity level cheeses, but also trying to stretch flavor outside of what is traditionally artisan cheese. So we had a Cabot 3-year sharp cheddar, which was a little bit more mature, not typically thought of as artisan, but more flavor development, and Parmesan cheese, which stretched the flavor dimensions in a slightly different direction. And we use the product attribute elicitation method approach to conduct the sessions. So what is that approach? Why is this so different? Here are the steps in a PEM session. So this is the consumers come in the room. Typically, we're working with a much smaller group of consumers, but spending more time with them and walking them through some exercises to dive deeper into what they like and don't like and unbundle the reasons why. So the first thing that we do is we take those samples that we want to test, we randomize them, we cold them, and we give them to the consumers in different orders, and they don't know what the cheese is. And we ask them to evaluate each of those cheeses before we have any discussion, before we do anything. So they go through the set of samples one at a time, and they rate their overall liking, and we'll go through that in a moment. Then when they're done all of that, rating how much they like or don't like the cheese samples, we facilitate a discussion where we simply collect their words. We don't give them anything. We don't make suggestions. We simply go around the room and say, okay, sample number 1, whichever sample you got, what did you like about that or what did you not like? Give me your words. And we record exactly what they wrote. We then have them work as a group to put words in categories. So for example, they might have had too much cheese flavor, not enough cheese flavor, just right cheese flavor. They might decide, you know what, all those talk about cheese flavor, let's put them together. Do that, we don't create the categories. All the categories are created by the people in the room. It's sometimes difficult getting them to understand what they need to do without giving them an example. For example, we can't give them that example of, hey, look, you've got, different ones that talk about cheese flavor. Maybe you want to have a cheese flavor category. We can't do that. The facilitator is prohibited from making suggestions or helping the group. They have to come up with everything on their own. After they get done putting those words in categories, we have them vote. Individually, it's called multi-voting. We give them a certain number of votes, and they tell us, okay, for you as an individual, which of those categories was most important for when you think about whether you liked or didn't like the samples? And they vote on it, and I'll show you some of those results. And then what we have them do is create a ballot. We say, okay, if we asked you to go back and taste some cheeses, a new set of cheeses, and score the cheeses on these categories, what would the category name be? So what are they scoring? And what are the endpoints? And I'm going to share that with you. And then after they do that, we give them another sample, a set of samples, blind, random order. But this time, rather than being subjective, rather than it being a hedonic test, they evaluate each sample almost as a trained panelist because they've developed their own objective ballot with categories that they came up with scales that they came up with, and they go through and rate each sample on each of those categories that they came up with. And this is very powerful information for us when we get the correlation phase. So first piece, they come in the room, we tell them we're going to give them some cheeses. We show them a score sheet that looks similar to the one that's on the slide here. You notice now that underneath the happy faces for sample 1 is a line for comments. The instructions we give them is, look, you're gonna taste sample number 1, smell and taste it. You're gonna cross off one of these faces. How much do you like it or not like it? And just as importantly, you're gonna write in your own words underneath those happy faces why you liked it or didn't like it. And we ask them, please don't use words like good or bad, or, yeah, I would eat this. We know that by how you crossed off your face, whether you liked it or not. We want to know why. What was it about the sample that you liked? Or what was it about the sample that you didn't like? And we try to get them to be as objective as possible, again, without giving them examples. It's very important that the facilitator not use any terms or give them anything at this point. Everything has to come from the consumer. Now, what's interesting is when we did this test and we had 40 people between the two groups, you'll notice on the left-hand side, the overall liking score that they gave us. No surprises here. Pretty similar to what we saw in the other test. The mature cheese, which was the 3-year Cabot cheddar, scored the highest of the group. Ashbrook and Reading scored a little higher in this group. We're going to come back to that in a few seconds. And the Harbison and the Whitney fell toward the bottom of the list. But what we did in this case, just to illustrate the fact that we think that there's segmentation going on, is we can separate the data out by group. And group A was the group that said they sometimes eat artisan cheese. Group B was the group that said they mostly eat artisan cheese. And you notice that we do see some separation of the average overall liking. So with the Cabot, we still see pretty high numbers for both groups. Everybody loves Cabot, that kind of a very clean aged cheese taste. And the Ashbrook is kind of interesting here that with both groups were still very high. But look what happens with the Harbison and what happens down here with the Whitney. We have the overall liking score for the group that mostly eats artisan cheese going up relative to the one that says they sometimes eat it. This kind of a thing here with the Harbison and down here with the Whitney, where we see that in that particular segment, the score actually went up, tells us, okay, we need to explore more with that group of people. We need to identify more of this group and really understand what that segment is, who they are, and how big that segment possibly is. For our purposes, we are relatively in line and can achieve our linkage in the bigger study. And I'll go through that at the end of this, but more so in the final webinar where we bring all the data together and start linking things and talking about what we learned. But we can even start linking the consumer data with objective measurements at this point. There is a separate seminar that I did talking about the trained panel results. And at this point, now that we start to get some consumer information, we can start to do some simple and quadratic correlations to see if any relationship is. Example, with this data, if we plot consumer overall liking of these consumers in the PEM study versus balance of flavor as measured by the trained panel, what we see is that as balance of flavor goes up, overall liking goes up. Well, that makes sense to us. It's one of the flavor leadership criteria. People like things that have more balanced flavor. But in these other graphs, you can see as the intensity of off notes or others goes up, overall liking comes down. As the intensity of mouthfeel goes up, overall liking comes down. As lingering aftertaste goes up, overall liking comes down. Consumer overall liking goes down as the others, the mouthfeel and the aftertaste goes up. All of this is known. We check it every time we do consumer testing, but we know that the flavor leadership criteria are real. They are real within the big segment. They also hold true in smaller segments, can be a topic of a different webinar. But flavor leadership criteria, knowing the core drivers of consumer overall liking, are very, very powerful, and they hold true in all of these studies. Now, it's important here because it is going to help us understand artisan cheese. And when we start to compare some of those segmental cheeses, tell us where we need to be to win in those segments. I'm not going to cover that type of segmentation in this webinar, however. Now, after we had them rate their overall liking, remember in the session, the next thing they do is create categories with their words. So for example, when we collected all the words in the groups, here are some terms that they used. We didn't give these. Had a strange smell, unpleasant smell, was pungent, cow pus, smells like feet, Barney, chicken poop, dog poop. These are typical consumer words. And the consumers decided to group all these words together, call the category odd smell. I smell something odd in the cheese. Now, in these boxes, you'll see the percentage of the votes. This got 12% of the votes as something that drove whether they liked or didn't like something. Another category was what they called, and again, all these category titles are created by the consumers, not by us. They said cheese flavor intensity. All right, strong cheese, mild cheese, it's sharp, it's tangy, it's Romano, it's bland, it's too sour, too mild. They decided these terms were all talking about the cheese flavor intensity. They actually rated that as their most important category at 28%. They had a category called texture. They said the cheese was pasty or flaky or smooth or chewy or rubbery or gritty. And all of these words, they said, we want to put it in just a category called texture. And they voted 16%. Another category was something they said, well, we have certain mouthfeels. It feels like it coats my mouth. It hurts, it's stinging, it's watery, it's burning. I taste like I have little crystals in my mouth. It hits the back of my throat. Again, these are very typical terms and expressions that come from consumers, not sure what they mean yet, but they put them together as a group and put them in a category called mouthfeel. Odd flavor. Okay, bad taste, tastes like dirt, sweaty, spoiled, putrid, gym socks, all of these things they put together and said, you know, there's something odd in the flavor. And then they had a category for bitter. Pretty much some of the samples, they didn't have a lot of the samples, but some of the samples had a little bit of bitter and some they thought were very bitter. And then the final three categories they called salty, consistency, interesting category, their term, that they wanted two categories, earlier category called texture and now one called consistency. And the words that they put in this category were dense, hard, soft, creamy, rich, chalky. Some of these words like creamy appeared in both categories and they didn't want to move them. They thought that sensory dimension or that sensory characteristic was part of both texture and consistency, so they left it in both boxes. And then they had a category called aftertaste. Okay, the taste lingers, leaves a bad taste. It's a weird aftertaste. Okay, now they created their own score sheet. Again, we gave them nothing. So basically for every one of those categories, starting with odd smell, we said, all right, you're going to measure it on a 1 to 7 scale. What's a 1? What's a 7? Well, it's going to go from no odd smell to strong or somewhere in between. They came up with the words for the scales. We gave them the 7-point scale. It's a standard intensity scale. 9-point scale. This is an intensity scale. Cheese flavor went from weak to strong. Texture went from smooth to rough. Their words, not ours. Mouthfeel, not much to a lot. Odd flavor from none to strong. Bitterness, not bitter to very bitter. Salty, not salty to very salty. Consistency, soft to hard. So now we begin to see the difference between consistency and texture, at least what they're saying, because we haven't given them anything. Smooth to rough was texture. Consistency was soft to hard. And aftertaste, no lingering aftertaste, a strong weakening aftertaste. This is their score sheet. And while they develop this score sheet, they have trained themselves to use this score sheet, to know what this score sheet is and how to measure it. So then we give them another set of samples blind, and we ask them to score each sample on each of their categories that they came up with using the scales that they came up with. And when we look at the average data, we can see that they did show differences. So for example, odd aroma, average score is a 6.3 on that 7-point intensity scale versus something like Reading, which was down to the 2.6, or the Ashbrook and Whitney in between. I want you to really think about what I'm showing you now. This is a consumer test, but this is not hedonic data. This is not subjective. This is now consumers who have partially trained themselves to their own words and categories and scales, now attempting to objectively measure the things that they said were important to us on a set of samples. This is incredibly powerful information. And as I go through this, we are very happy because we're seeing ranges. We're seeing ranges in cheese flavor intensity, some ranges in texture, some ranges in mouthfeel, certainly an odd flavor here, going from 2.6 all the way up to a 5.9. So we have all this data now that we can begin to correlate and gain further insights in what the consumers are saying about cheese. So for example, we can look at, well, what did they mean by cheese flavor intensity? And going back to this slide, cheese flavor intensity went from weak to strong is what they wanted to measure. And it's almost counterintuitive because as we correlate their overall liking score of samples versus their measurement of cheese flavor intensity, this is all consumer now. On the left, on the y-axis is the subjective hedonic information. On the x-axis is their objective attribute. What we see is that as their perception of cheese flavor intensity goes up, their overall liking goes down. Now, one of the things that we're going to see later in this presentation, but we're really going to see in the last webinar when we bring it all together, is that this is a little deceiving. As we begin to explore this further, and we begin to link this to the trained panel result, we begin to understand that what the consumer's calling cheese flavor intensity is negative cheese flavor intensity, stinky cheese, something they don't like. Because cheese flavor intensity itself is not linear. It's going to be a quadratic relationship, meaning the flavor strength has to be within a certain intensity. If it's stronger than that, they don't like it as much. And if it's less than that, they don't like it as much. But we're going to see that later when we start to do other links to the consumer information. We can correlate their measure of overall liking against aftertaste. All of these types of measurements, even though we're not sure what they're really saying, if they really mean lingering taste, we know these are linear. We know from the flavor leadership criteria that things like aftertaste and off notes. Here's another one. This is their overall liking versus their odd flavor. All of this continues to reinforce what we know and give us confidence in the flavor leadership criteria. But by doing these graphs, we can begin to understand the terms they came up with, how they think those terms affect their overall liking, because that's what we're correlating here. We're not correlating overall liking as we did earlier against the trained panel measure. This is correlating against what they're saying, and it helps us to interpret what they really want. Now, the other thing that we asked them, I'll just touch on this briefly, because again, this was not a study for us to explore the whole cheese world and all segmentations. But one of the things we asked them was to rate two cheeses from memory on their score sheet. So the first cheese that we asked them to rate was, we asked them to think about the cheese that they ate the most often. And in fact, we said, if we think about the artisan cheese that you eat the most often, if you had that here in front of you, how would that score on these attributes? And these are the average scores that they gave us on their attributes. Again, this is all the consumer data. Then we asked them a different question. All right, well, that's the one that you eat now. That's how you would score it if you had it here and you were tasting it. But let's pretend you could make best cheese that for you, the one that you love the most, the one that's ideal. How would that score? And so they go through each of these categories and they score that. And what's really interesting, look to get some further insights into what they want by comparing how they scored what they're eating now, at least what they remember what they're eating now, versus what they really want. And what they're saying is, well, odd smell, my cheese has some, but very little. My ideal would have even less of that odd smell. The cheese I have now has that cheese flavor intensity, but again, remember, we're going to clarify that again down the line. the idea would have less of that, meaning less of that negative cheese intensity. Texture is a different ball game. It's very complex. We're not diving deep into the texture notes in this webinar. We have more work to do when it comes to texture with the consumer testing, because the cheeses we select were extremely different on some of the texture notes that were defined by the consumer. Mouthfeel, they're saying, I want less mouthfeel than the cheese I eat most often. I want less off notes, odd flavor. I want it to be a little less bitter. That's kind of an interesting one. And this one over here is really interesting to me. They're even saying, look, the cheese I eat most often now has an aftertaste. I'd like my ideal cheese to taste like this cheese, but have less aftertaste. And so we begin to develop additional insights. And to summarize, what consumers are telling us, they want less odd aroma, using their terms again, more texture, less mouthfeel, less odd flavor, less aftertaste. Now, we're going to translate what all that means in the next webinar by correlating all of this against the professional trained panel measurements to find out what are they really saying, what do they really mean, because we had our panel, the trained panel, taste the same samples as these consumers did in these studies. And so we have the objective data on all of these samples. One of the things that comes across loud and clear in the consumer piece of this overall project is that the quality index that was developed by UVM Extension using their descriptive sensory analysis panel, their trained panel, is effective at comparing the core sensory properties of cheese and being predictive. We always know this going in, but it's nice to gain the confidence. It's nice to confirm. So, for example, if we apply the quality index, this is not a consumer measurement. This is the trained panel tasting this range of cheeses, the same cheeses that we use in the PEM study, and saying, look, some of these cheeses were less balanced, had more mouthfeel, more others, and a lingering aftertaste, as measured by the trained panel. And we correlate that quality index against consumer reaction. And lo and behold, what the trained panel says is less quality because it's less balanced, more mouthfeel, more others, and lingering aftertaste. Using trained people, overall liking went down. This becomes predictive. We can now use the quality index to begin to predict, at least on these core drivers of overall liking, how consumers are going to respond. This is going to become super important in the final webinar, where we begin to link the quality of the cheeses in our big test to the microbiology results, to the healthy fat results, to the descriptive panel to see how they're interpreting everything, to variables at the cheese making facility, so that we can say, okay, when it had those microbes, the quality went up or down. If it had these microbes, it went up or down. If it had these healthy fats, did the quality go up or down? And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to link things to help the cheese makers understand how to produce the highest quality cheese consistently. And so the quality index works. All of this consumer data has confirmed to us that the quality index that we will be using in the bigger study is effective and is predictive. Here's another way of looking at that. I've superimposed the actual overall liking average numbers from the PEM test onto a flavor map. Now, this flavor map itself is so the trained panel tasted and measured balance of flavor. That's the y-axis. They measured all of those other attributes that go into the quality index, and that's the x-axis. And we've superimposed the results. How much did the consumers in this test like or not like the samples? And you can see as we're going down here, first of all, that this should be linear balance versus quality index, because balance is part of quality index. But as we can see, the numbers dropping as the quality index go down. Higher numbers are less quality, as indicated in the previous slide. So this is really interesting and really helps us to understand not just relative, but we know what the regions of these flavor maps are. We know how much mouthfeel, how salty they are, how much cheese, because that's how these maps are developed using that score sheet. That's the subject of the descriptive webinar. If you have an interest, go watch the descriptive webinar where I go over all of that information. Again, this makes sense if we monitor quality versus the professional or the trained panel measurement of others. You can see that as the quality number goes up, which means quality is going down, the others' intensity is going up. And you can see that as both of those things happen, consumer acceptance goes down. The lower, remember now, anything less than a 5 is I don't like it. Anything above a 5 is I like it. So we can almost define a point here where we're below, quality below that point. So if the number's higher, consumers aren't going to like it at all. But if we stay to the left of this, they will like it and will be basing their consumption on other factors in addition to the core drivers. Now, some of the relationships are going to be very complicated. I'm not going to go through all of the relationships in this study because that really is part of the linkage that will happen in the final webinar. But here's an example of one that might be a quadratic relationship. And quadratic relationships simply mean that they're not linear. There is a point where the cheese user will like it the most. And if you go above that level, overall liking starts to go down. Or if you go below it, it starts to go down. And you can almost imagine, the hyperbolic graphing of this kind of a graph. I'm not saying this is quadratic yet. We have to do all that analysis to define it. We expect things like total intensity of flavor to be quadratic. Interestingly enough, if we eyeball this one and we see that total intensity of flavor around a 5, that's where it is for most market leading products for the big segments of consumers. People love products that are at that moderate level intensity for what they're looking for. If you get above that level, well, it's things they'll sip and savor, but they don't consume as much. They don't like it as much. And if you get below that level, it's not enough for them. So that being around that moderate level is something we see all the time, and this makes sense. The point on this slide is that we do expect to see lots of quadratic relationships in the data when we bring it together. So what did we learn from the consumer testing piece? We learned a lot, and we definitely met our targets. Well, one thing we learned is that artisan cheese users like mature cheese flavor. No surprise there. They like the Alfred Toman. They like the Terran taste. Both of these are high quality mature cheese products in the market up here in Vermont. We saw that unique cheese flavor, such as with the Harbison and the Whitney, is polarizing, indicating flavor segmentation. Really not a surprise there for us to know that there's some segmentation there. But for the big segment, it's important to see where all that falls out. We were able to gain confidence yet again that the flavor leadership criteria are real and that we can use that moving forward to predict what's quote unquote good or bad when we start linking things. We learned that consumers in this study said that cheese flavor intensity is important to them, but what it showed was when they talk about cheese flavor intensity, it's not necessarily a positive. What they were showing is that when they say cheese flavor intensity, they're focusing on negative cheese flavor, and the higher that negative cheese flavor is, the less they like the cheese. So this is the kind of discussion that we'll have with marketing people when we start talking about messaging and branding and how do we talk to cheese users. And in this case, the answer might be, well, we're going to talk about, positive cheese flavor and negative, and say, look, you're not going to get, this has very low intensity negative cheese flavor or negative things that you want. Or to avoid this term altogether, which is more often the case, is don't talk about the negatives. So don't even talk about cheese flavor intensity because it might be confusing to them. Because what they call cheese flavor intensity is not exactly what you want to call cheese flavor intensity, because a cheesemaker wants to call cheese flavor what the consumer is looking for only, the good stuff. And that's not what the consumers are telling us in this study. The cheese users want less odd aroma, odd flavor, more texture. I'm going to define that all more. This all makes sense to us, that artisan cheese users are no different than people that drink beer or orange juice or milk or anything else that we've studied. We also learned that the quality index developed by the UVM descriptive sensory analysis panel, and that is based on flavor leadership criteria, is effective in predicting responses. We know that to be true, but every time we do a study, it's something that we look at just to make sure that something unique is not going on. Something unique might be something like a functional sensory characteristic, which sometimes has override some of the flavor leadership criteria if there's, some strong functionality, whether it's a health effect or economic or something else. And that we do in this data see again that what we expected, that there will be quadratic relationships once we start doing all the correlations that are going to indicate that some of the sensory characteristics of the cheese have to fall in a certain target range. It's not linear, but they have to be in a certain target range to maximize consumer acceptance and overall liking, and ultimately success in the market. We expect these characteristics to include things like total intensity of flavor, something the trained panel measures, cheese identity. The trained panel measures butyric character and then separately isovaleric character. And we have some indices that have to do with cheese identity that we believe will be quadratic relationships. Savoriness of cheese is something that usually is quadratic. There is such a thing as having too much savory flavor, as well as not enough. And then all of the maturity notes. I give as an example nutty here, but there's a lot of maturity notes, fruity notes, nutty notes that we know is not linear, that there has to be a certain amount, but we don't want to go above it or below it to maximize overall liking. And so now to finish up, as I did in the descriptive sensory webinar, now that we have the consumer data and we have the objective data from the UVM extension descriptive panel, the trained panel, and we have other data in this study, the microbiology, the healthy fats, some chemistry information, stuff that was going on in the processing of the variables. We even have some milk data. We now can go and begin to link the data in ways that we can understand, okay, what microbiology might be driving what flavor? Is that flavor something the consumer wants or not? How does the chemistry factor in? What about the healthy fats? Are the things that taste good the ones that have high healthy fats? Are they not? How do we link those together? And once we begin to link all this data, we can begin to have a discussion around engineering by understanding all these different variables that go into what cheese is and understanding consumer reactions to the end product. We can begin to have a discussion around engineering the process, engineering the cheese by manipulating microbiology, by manipulating the variables in the cheese making facility, by maybe the milk, but being able to engineer higher quality cheese to better meet the needs of the artisan cheese market. A lot of information in a short period of time. My name is Roy DeRocher. I am the sensory practice leader in UVM Extension's Northwest Crops and Soils program. Thank you very much for listening in. I hope it was informative. We have a lot of information that will be appearing in the overall final report for this study. If anyone's interested, we'll be posting that. And if you have any questions, always feel free to contact us at UVM Extension. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time. Goodbye.